In a world full of 3 and 5 act story structures, you may have never heard of this ancient Eastern way to deliver a story. It's called a chiasm. It's usually shaped like an hourglass or a diamond so that the repeating patterns of the story can get folded over one another. I first learned of this pattern from Marty Silliman, who runs the BEMA Podcast. And I'm featuring it in this series here because it was this episode that pushed me over the edge, away from my literalist interpretation of Genesis. But he not only changed my mind on Genesis, he changed the way I look at the entire biblical narrative. Part 2 now of how BEMA Podcast and Marty Solomon changed my mind on Genesis. We talked in the previous episode just outlining some basic ways in which the Eastern mindset is different than the Western mindset, how this causes an approach to words, to numbers, to stories, to definitions, to these things is very different for each of those. We're going to see some of that here today. And so I want to just hop right in. Yesterday was from episode 0. This is from episode 1 of the BEMA Podcast. This is called Trust the Story. So let's get started.
Is what is said all throughout the poem. It was good, and God saw that it was good, and it was good, and God saw that it was good. And so if we just kind of step back, we start to see that actually this poem is maybe not about the things that we might have been raised or have been taught that this poem is about. Because we have all kinds of problems. First of all, it's evening and morning. But second of all, plants are created on day 3. The day of separating the land from the sea. But the sun isn't created until day 4, but the plants can't be created without the sun. So how does that work scientifically? Let alone the fact that the only way we've ever measured a day in all of human history has been the movement of, from one perspective, the sun, or our movement in relation to the sun. It's always been related to the sun. But if the sun isn't created till the 4th day, it raises the question of how do we even know the first 3 days are even days?
This goes back to John Lennox's comments about the use of the word day or yom in Genesis here. Marty's pointing out some of the same problems you get when you think of just day as 24-hour period, the movement of the sun or the movement of the earth. And so again, we get the same thing here with this very straight, materialist, scientific reading of the text. It's very difficult then to pull out what says morning and evening, days, day 1, 2, 3, but there's no sun. What do we do with the sun, the plants, all this stuff, these things that break down when you start to put that lens on it don't compute. This is more of what Marty's pulling out. And as I said last episode, these sets of episodes here on the BEMA Podcast are what pushed me over the edge. I'm standing in my parents' basement, resting between sets, trying to work out, but just like so transfixed on this. And it was a moment like that, like Martin Shaw, when he gets asked, what's been happening to you recently? And he says, at that moment, I guess I knew I was a Christian. I wasn't converting to Christianity at this moment, but it was definitely a moment. I'm standing there in my parents' basement, having done some pull-ups, and Marty's like, what if this thing happens? What if we have the wrong quit? And I'm like, I'm here now. I'm there. I was like, yeah, I'm there. But I've been thinking about, as I've been doing this whole series, I've been thinking about this for years and years, and I get here, and he's repeating some stuff enough. He's putting it in some different categories. He's talking about the Eastern mindset versus the Western mindset. I'm starting to think maybe I need to think about this more Easternly. All this stuff, and this episode here especially just pushes me over the edge. Let's keep going.
It really becomes clear the moment you start to look at this poem. This poem is not about the scientific reality of how creation was made. this poem is about something far deeper. And so if you just kind of step back, and if you remember our last podcast, we talked about the Easterner understanding the world through pictures and images. And if we stop reading Genesis 1 like a lab report, because it's not a scientific lab report, if we read it as the piece of literature that it is and we step back, we notice this poem and we have to start asking a whole new set of questions. And so we might realize if we just look at it from a macro 10,000 foot level, we might recognize that this poem is about creating, obviously, and it's also about resting. It has this.
In this 10,000 foot view, these different sets of questions are what I started this whole series with. Tim Mackey, John Piper. Tim Mackey being like, look, maybe the questions we're coming to the text with, especially with this account of creation, aren't the questions it's trying to address. So Marty's going to get into telling us what he thinks his mode of, what kinds of questions he sees this as addressing. But again, this is just this is the final thing. This is just push me over.
It's weird ending. It's all about creation, but then at the end of the story, God rests. And so this poem is about creating, but it also seems to be about resting. And so we continue to look at this poem because we want to know more about it. And if we look at this poem, we start to notice that if we look at day 5, fish go in water and birds go in the sky, which means that day 5 corresponds to day 2. And the sun, moon, and stars go in the place where there's light, which again was one of those questions. How did we have light without the source of the light? But nevertheless, we have day 4 corresponding to day 1, day 5 corresponding to day 2, and in fact, animals and humans are what inhabit the land, so day 6 corresponds to day 3. And when you actually go back and start to look closely at this relationship, you realize that God really doesn't create much of anything in this actual narrative. What he does in the first 3 days is God separates. He doesn't create light and darkness. He separates light from darkness. He doesn't create the water and the sky. He separates water from water. He separates land from seas. And then in the next 3 days, 4, 5, and 6, God fills the very 3 things in the same order that he's previously separated. Now, what this does for a Hebrew, if they see this story as a picture, is it draws this imaginary line straight down the middle of the story, because day 1 corresponds to day 4, day 2 to day 5, and day 3 to day 6, meaning if you folded this story up in the middle, it would fold up on itself. And this is called, in their world, it's called a chiasm, or a chiasmus if you're reading scholastic literature. But we're going to call them chiasms in our study. This ends up being a chiasm. Now, a chiasm is a particular literary tool that Easterners use. One of the things we discussed in our discussion groups this last week was that Easterners don't teach the way that Westerners do. Westerners like to teach by making a point and then giving the supporting evidences, the supporting proof, or the supporting information, the logic and the reasoning to prove their point. But an Easterner has a fundamental belief that true learning doesn't happen with the transfer of information. True learning happens because you discover a new truth. So the art of discovery is everything for an Easterner, which means that when they write their stories, somewhere in the story is something that the author wants you to discover. It's not going to be blinking in bold lights on top of the story. It's going to be buried in the story because the Eastern author, writing to an Eastern audience, is trying to lead you through the process of discovery. And so they had all these methods, and they had all.
I need to comment on this quickly. No, I don't. No, I don't. Let's talk about this buried treasure for a second. Some of you who know me in real life, or some of you who have been listening very carefully, may know that I am attempting to become Eastern Orthodox. I say attempting to become because I have not even become catechumen in my church yet. I'm still going and investigating and getting involved and reading some necessary things, but albeit said, I'm not even officially a catechumen yet. And so I say this only to say about my experience. This Eastern way is not just something I've been experiencing and studying Genesis, but it's become very real for me in church. How can I describe this? There are many things that are weird about the Orthodox, whether it be the services, whether it be the icons, whether it be communion or prayer or any number of practices that are strange. And the thing that I've found in talking to many people that go there and talking to my own priest is everyone, in my attitude, wanting to be fast and quick and make the decision right away, or to push the limits of where I maybe should get involved or how quickly I should be taking things upon myself. The thing that everyone tells me is, slow down. You're going to be okay. Because I think that they know the cost. There is something here. There's more than I sign a document that says I agree. There is something else going on. There is this sense of the teaching and the practice and even the services themselves contain so much buried treasure. And no one's going to hold your hand. Yes, people will help you if need be, but the way in which everything is done is not in the sense to make everyone be comfortable with it right away, or to, I don't want to sound disparaging. It is not seeker-friendly, put it that way, in the sense that we would use seeker-friendly. But it is seeker-friendly in the sense that if you really want to seek, for those who have ears, let them hear. Jesus, why do you speak in parables? In order to confuse them. That's what it feels like so many times going to church for me. But there's something about the buried treasure. There's something about the slowness. There's something about I think many times we want drive-through faith. We want drive-through health transformations. I mean, just look at what's going on with Ozempic right now. And I'm not disparaging anyone who takes Ozempic or who needs to take Ozempic. But we want the silver bullet. We want the magic pill. We want the instant transformation. We want the thing that's going to get me there the fastest in 30 days or 15 days or 90 days. And I'm a victim of that too. Or I want the 2-day Amazon delivery, which I got this morning. But with many things in life, that's not how it works. With faith, spirituality, with church, it's not how it works. Most of the time. So to be in a tradition that is actually Eastern in this sense, which buries the treasure and says you can go find it, there's something very different about that. There's something very amazing about that. There's something very gracious about that. There's something very demanding about that. So I just say that to say I've experienced that not only in studying the Bible, but now in being in church. This Eastern way of thinking, this way of burying the treasure, this way of not just teaching you in terms of like, here's the proof, and here's how you support it. Here's all your evidences. But it's many times it is something you have to be there for. That's it.
All these literary tools that they would use to accomplish this process of discovery. And so one of those tools is chiasm. And chiasm means that the first part of the story mirrors the last part of the story. It can mirror it in two different ways. It can either be A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A, meaning it actually mirrors each other, A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A. Or a chiasm can also have the mirroring effect of a parallelism. It can be called an inverted parallelism or a parallelism. It can be A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. So it can go A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A, or it can go A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. It can also be structured almost visually, so that that same A, B, C, C, B, A type order, you can actually see. A chiasm can be shaped like an arrow, either directly or inverted. And you'll see in the show notes in the presentation there, I've shown you a couple examples. A chiasm can be shaped like an hourglass, almost like an arrow pointing to the center, or a chiasm can be shaped almost like a diamond, where it gets larger and then gets smaller again, but everything is driven towards the center. It mirrors. It's like a story folded up on itself. Now, what's so interesting about Genesis 1, and Genesis 1 is not the easiest chiasm to start with, but it's where God chooses to start his story, is Genesis 1 happens to be both chiasms at the same time. Now, here's what I mean.
Now I'm gonna leave this here. He's given us enough front work for the chiasm, and obviously he sees Genesis, as he just said, as doing this chiastic structure, as doing many of these things at once. If you want to hear that, you can listen to the middle bit of the podcast. I'll put it down below. What I want to jump to is what he sees as what's at the center of the chiasm here, which is where the real truth, where the meat is, where the treasure is buried, is in the center.
And 7 times in reference to things on earth. This poem is full of patterns. 3s, 7s, 10s. This is not a scientific lab report. It's not a scientific lab report. It's not a scientific lab report. It's not trying to tell us how God created the world. It's a chiasm. Now, how does the chiasm work? How is this burying a treasure for me to discover? Well, that chiasm points towards the center. And if you look at that diagram on your show notes, you're going to see how these chiasms are structured. And then I've added some notes myself to the next slide, and it shows you where the treasure lies. The entire chiasm points toward the center where the treasure is. You can often find a chiasm by identifying the bookends. Every chiasm will have its outermost, its furthest reaching points where the chiasm begins. And so you find these bookends at the top and at the bottom, and then you begin to work towards the center. And it's the bookends that are going to help you find the center where the treasure lies. Now, in the story of Genesis, you might remember that creation started with what, Brent?
God creating light.
Okay. Before that.
In the beginning.
Okay. The earth was
formless and empty.
And what did we say tohu vavohu meant?
Wild and waste.
Yes. And you put what in a blender?
Nothing.
Chaotic nothingness.
Chaotic nothingness.
Okay. Now, at the end of the poem, what does God do?
He rests.
Which means he does what?
Nothing.
So this poem is bookended by resting, or by nothingness might be the more appropriate way of phrasing it. The story starts with nothing. The story ends with nothing. And so if you take this creation poem and you actually physically count Hebrew words, there's a Hebrew word that lies dead center in the middle of the poem. And the Hebrew word is the word moad. Now, in the old translations, we used to translate moad seasons. It shows up right where you would want it to. If you consider that there are these 7 creation days, you would expect the center of this poem to lie somewhere in day 4. Well, in fact, on day 4, God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars to mark the days, the years, and the seasons, or the moad. Or I think, as this new NIV translated it, the sacred time. Now, moad ends up being one of 4 words that we translate Sabbaths, or at least the idea of Sabbath, festivals.
Okay, so Marty's going to go on and give his interpretation of... how he uses this word, season, Sabbath, sacred times, to draw out some implications from the text here. I'm going to go a little bit of a different direction than him. If you want to hear his specific interpretation, again, I'll link his podcast episode down below. Some very, very good stuff there. Very good stuff. I'm not doing this to counter or to say that he's false in his interpretation here. I think it is a very good interpretation. I think it's worth incarnating, put it that way. But again, let's think of I'm going to give you some C.S. Lewis here in a minute. But let's think again about this progression. I've moved from maybe the initial questions I was asking about the text aren't the right questions to ask. Okay, so what is the text and what are some of the questions I've been asking? Well, how old's the earth? Well, I saw in John Piper that you can be seriously thinking about the Bible, and Tim Mackey, and you can take how old the earth is and have a different perspective and still be a Christian. We talked about some of the borrowing of the traditions in Genesis from the surrounding cultures. What does that mean for the truthfulness, in some sense, of the text? What does it mean for its meaning that it carries? Tim Mackey talked a lot about that. Les Newbegin talked some about that. We talked about Jordan Peterson and the Christian fundamentalist and the atheist materialist are playing the same game, right? Because they want to know about the physical of the creation when there might be something else going on here. Again, back on the same point of what are the initial questions we're asking, what should we be asking? Linux challenges us to see what are the major emphases of the text. Here Marty is pulling out a major emphasis of the text being seasons, being rest, according to this chiastic structure that he sees coming about here. What lies in the center is part of the treasure. What do you pull from that treasure? We're going to get to that in just a second. And then we've got Adam and Eve, Stephen King, Tim Mackey, helping us think about the literary nature, even of just the storytelling that's going on here in Genesis, if it isn't a scientific lab report, if it isn't just telling us about the 1, 2, 3 of creation as an experiment might, or as a lab report would, or a textbook would, if it isn't just telling us about the physical facts on the ground, but is trying to say something deeper, why would that deeper message be different than the deeper messages that come across in other literature? If it is truly doing something literarily here. So that's the journey I've been on. That's the journey I've been trying to show to you. And like I said, this podcast, these sets of podcasts, really pushed me, especially with that Eastern versus Western mindset thing, which is very important, which I'm going to make a video about Jordan Peterson on that, I think today. But this shift in the picture, the image, the narrative, the number, the quality, the symbolism, all of these things going into it, kind of just screaming at me, there's these other beautiful things going on. These other beautiful things going on. And so then just to take it as a physical report maybe is even a shallow way to say that thinking Christians, even thinking quote-unquote fundamentalist Christians would take it, might be cheap. But I'm just here to say that this has been my journey. I'm trying to show that to you. I'm trying to help you in that same sense. And like I said, even with my experiences in church now, it's not that these things change overnight. These things take a lot of time. And so, what can we pull out of this interpretation, out of this new frame of thinking about the literary nature, the narrative nature, the story nature? If this is a chiasm and the center is the moed, the season, the sacred times, what does this mean for us? Well, let's see. I'm going to read to you from Screwtape Letters. This is letter 25. And Lewis is here going to draw on, this idea of rhythm, of season, of time. So let's see what he has to say. My dear Wormwood, the real trouble about the set your patient is living in is that it is merely Christian. They all have individual interest, of course, but the bond remains mere Christianity. What we want, if men become Christians at all, is to keep them in the state of mind I call Christianity and, Christianity and the crisis, Christianity and new psychology, Christianity and the new order, Christianity and faith healing, Christianity and physical research, Christianity and vegetarianism, Christianity and spelling reform. If they must be Christians, let them at least be Christians with a difference. Substitute for faith itself some fashion with a Christian coloring. Work on their horror of the same old thing. The horror of the same old thing is one of the most valuable passions we have produced in the human heart. An endless source of heresies in religion, folly in counsel, infidelity in marriage, and inconsistency in friendship. The humans live in time and experience reality successively. To experience much of it, therefore, they must experience many different things. In other words, they must experience change. And since they need change, the enemy, being hedonist at heart, has made change pleasurable to them, just as he has made eating pleasurable. But since he does not wish them to make change any more than eating an end in itself, he has balanced the love of change in them by love of permanence. He has contrived to gratify both tastes together on the very world he has made. This is what Jonathan Pajot means when he talks about, when he says phrases like, this is how reality works. This is what he means. Since he does not wish them to make change any more than eating an end in itself, I know how much those two things are an end in themselves for me as much as they might be for you. He has balanced the love of change in them by a love of permanence. He has contrived to gratify both permanence which he is contrived to gratify both tastes together on the very world he has made, by that union of change and permanence which we call rhythm, or seasons, or moades. He gives them seasons, each season different, yet every year the same, so that spring is always felt as a novelty, yet always as the recurrence of an immemorial theme. He gives them, in his church, a spiritual year. They change from fast to a feast, but it is the same feast as before. Now, just as we pick out and exaggerate the pleasure of eating to produce gluttony, so we pick out this natural pleasantness of change and twist it into a demand for absolute novelty. This demand is entirely our workmanship. If we neglect our duty, men will be not only contented, but transported by the mixed novelty of familiarity, of snowdrops this January, sunrise this morning, plum pudding this Christmas. Children, until I have taught them better, will be perfectly happy with a seasonal round of games in which conquers succeeds hopscotch as regularly as autumn follows summer. Only by our incessant efforts is the demand of infinite or unrhythmical change kept up. This demand is valuable in various ways. In the first place, it diminishes pleasure while increasing desire. The pleasure of novelty is, by its very nature, more subject than any other to the law of diminishing returns. And continued novelty costs money, so that the desire for it spells avarice or unhappiness, or both. And again, the more rapturous this desire, the sooner it must eat up all the innocent sources of pleasure and pass on to those the enemy forbids. Thus, by inflaming the horror of the same old thing, we have recently made the arts, for example, less dangerous to us than perhaps they have been. Low-brow and high-brow artists alike being now daily drawn into fresh and still fresh excesses of licentiousness, unreason, cruelty, and pride. Finally, the desire for novelty is indispensable if we are to produce fashions or vogues. The use of fashions in thought is to distract the attention of men from their real dangers. We direct the fashionable outcry of each generation against those vices of which it is least in danger, and fix its approval on the virtue nearest to that vice which we are trying to make endemic. We see this with compassion in our modern day. The game is to have them running around with fire extinguishers whenever there is a flood, and all crowded to that side of the boat which is already near gunwale under water. Thus we make it fashionable to expose the dangers of enthusiasm at the very moment when they are all really becoming worldly and lukewarm. A century later, when we are really making them all Byronic and drunk with emotion, the fashionable outcry is directed against the dangers of the mere understanding. Cruel agers are put on their guard against sentimentality, feckless and idle ones against respectability, lecherous ones against Puritanism, and whenever all men are really hastening to be slaves or tyrants, we make liberalism the prime boogie. That is not our current state. I don't know what is. But the greatest triumph of all is to elevate this horror of the same old thing into a philosophy so that nonsense in the intellect may reinforce corruption in the will. It is here that the general evolutionary or historical character of modern European thought, partly our work, comes in so useful. The enemy loves platitudes of a proposed course of action. He wants men, so far as I can see, to ask very simple questions. Is it righteous? Is it prudent? Is it possible? Now, if we can keep men asking, is it in accordance with the general movement of our time? Is it progressive or reactionary? Is this the way that history is going? They will neglect the relevant questions, and the questions they do ask, of course, are unanswerable, for they do not know the future, and what the future will be depends very largely on just those choices which they now invoke the future to help them make. As a result, While their minds are buzzing in this vacuum, we have the better chance to slip in and bend them on the action we have decided on. And great work has already been done. Once they knew that some changes were for the better and others for the worse and others, again, indifferent, we have largely removed this knowledge. For the deceptive adjective, unchanged, we have substituted the emotional adjective, stagnant. We have trained them to think of the future as a promised land which favored heroes attain, not as something which everyone reaches at the rate of 60 minutes an hour, whatever he does, whoever he is. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. So in this way, in the way that the world has been made, not in the steps and processes, but in the form that it finally takes, through this narrative in Genesis, we see that in the creation of the world, there are many things to see in this text, but in this interpretation of the seasons, of the treasure being the moed, being the sacred times, with Marty, with Lewis, we see here that in the way that the world has been made, there is something revealed to us about our nature, about human beings, about who we are, made in the image of God, made to plow the land, made to bear children, made to do these things. And in God's wisdom, and the way He structured reality, and the way the world actually works, He intends to grant our desire for novelty, and our desire for stability in the way that the world works, in the seasons, and the times, and the feast, and the fast, and the calendar, and the day. There's always morning, there's always midday, there's always evening, there's always sleep, there's always waking. It's the way the world actually works. I'm not going to end it here. There's one more episode I want to do on Tim Mackey and his sermon on science and faith, which is kind of a capstone, I think, for a lot of this work that I've been doing here on this series. But again, the process here, I've just been trying to show you how my mind has changed about these things, what that has produced in me, and how that then now makes me interact and read the Bible, understand these stories, what I pull from them, what I glean from them, how I read other things in light of them. And so if this has resonated with you at all, I'm very happy. If this has helped you, I'm very happy. If you think that I'm crazy, I'm happy. If you think you want to get here but you don't know how, just give yourself some time. Watch his videos, look at these resources, read the Bible. I'm not here to convince you that this is right, necessarily. What I do want to do, I want to show you something and ask you, what do you think of that? And hopefully it's something that'll be good for you and good for me. So I guess that's where I'm going to end this episode here. I got some more work to do. Got one more episode in this series. Daniel's going to take over, do some more work in this kind of thing here. And so we will see you guys in the next one.